sounds like the revolution has arrived to Michigan. I'd like to thank Ethan for giving me that nice introduction and for all his hard work for the students for Ron Paul, and I appreciate that very much. I appreciate the numbers that have come out. He said we could get a couple hundred. Yeah, but look. Also, we'd like to introduce that young lady that I married 55 years ago, Carol. And one of our grandchildren, this is Linda, the company says all right. But the important issue to talk about is not very complicated. I guess we could have a lot of words to describe what we're trying to do, but I settled for one word, and that is liberty. And if we come around to understanding where liberty comes from and what the responsibility of government is, I think that will result in the best chance of having peace and prosperity throughout the world. Is no longer the country it was a few years back or a few decades back. It certainly isn't the republic that was intended by the Constitution. We no longer have a republican form of government. And the founders were very adamant about it. They talked about a republic versus a pure democracy, and they had very bad feelings about a pure democracy where the 51% could gang up on the minority and dictate the rules of economics or the rules of personal behavior on the minority. And I'm afraid that's where we are today. But the spirit is alive. Let me tell you, in this country, more and more people now are waking up. The people like you are wide awake. You know what's wrong. You know what has to be done. Washington is sound asleep. What we need to do is make sure they hear us and make sure they know what the message is, and that is for liberty. Approximately 100 years ago, we embarked on a different direction. We virtually gave up on the Constitution, and it's been whittled away constantly ever since. And even in the last few years, it's gotten much worse. In spite of the people waking up and wanting something different, we still have a job cut out for ourselves, because Washington isn't hearing us, and they have not changed, but we will make a difference. We will make sure they hear this message. Especially under the Woodrow Wilson administration, things certainly started in the wrong direction. Foreign policy was changed, accepting this so-called idealism of making the world safe for democracy. And look at the last 100 years. It hasn't been very safe. A lot of people have died, and there's less freedom in the world today, and there's less freedom in this country. Also, a few other things occurred in 1913. A couple things that we should reverse. One, for instance, is the 16th Amendment. I'd like to reverse it. I'd like to repeal it. Yeah! Now, if we understand truly the Jefforsonian approach to saying that our life and our liberty comes from our Creator, the consequence ought to be that the fruits of our labor ought to be our own and not the government's. Item that they passed in 1913, and every once in a while I mention, and that was the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. I'd like to repeal that as well.
In the Fed.
It will come. It will come. If we can't do it quickly, then put them down and stop the spot. They have their anniversary coming up. It'll be 100 years old next year. So I think for the 100th anniversary, what we ought to do is repeal the Federal Reserve Act. talk about this money system all the time and the Federal Reserve and concentrating on sound money and the Constitution. Isn't that so old-fashioned? Well, the founders knew something about this. They suffered through the inflation of the continental dollar. There was total destruction of the continental money. And therefore, they didn't want it to happen to us. They wanted to protect us. So they put in the Constitution only gold and silver could be legal tender, and that you could not print paper money, and that you don't have authority to start a central bank. So we've sort of violated that a bit. They didn't amend the Constitution. They just totally ignore it. We now today have a unit of account called a Federal Reserve note, and they sometimes refer to it as a dollar. But if you ask them, define a dollar, they have no idea how to define a dollar. They say, well, it means it's a Federal Reserve note. So they're trying to protect the value of something they don't even know what it is, and they can't even define it. Then they wonder why they have a mess in Washington and around the world. The dollar and the money issue is so important because it's 1/2 of everything we transact. Whether you're measuring wages or prices or incomes or interest rates, it's all measured by this dollar that you can't define. And then they wonder how we got into this mess. But the whole problem, starting in 1913, was to establish a growth path for big government. You know, whether it was the income tax. Unfortunately, Jefferson lost the argument at the beginning of our country when he argued we shouldn't even be able to borrow, but we've been able to borrow all this time. So they also then said, well, taxes are limited because the people will rebel. The market limits borrowing because the interest rates will go too high. So that's why we had to have a central bank, because if we come up short, the federal government can always take their bills and their debt and send it to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve just prints the money. It sounds good, sounds like a good thing, especially if it works, and it worked for a while. It works for a while until the country gets too much in debt. And even 20, 30 years ago, the debt wasn't that outrageous. But we were a creditor nation. We were on the positive side, even during the Depression. Today, we are the biggest debtor nation in the history of the world. And they think the solution is spend more money and print more money. It's virtual insanity to think you can get out of trouble by doing the mistakes that have brought on the trouble. That's why we have to think about monetary policy, listen to the founders, and say, take away the power of the government and the Federal Reserve to create money out of thin air to finance war. Is a moral and a constitutional issue, but it's also very much of a government issue, government growth issue. Because it accommodates and it hides the bills for a while, governments can grow. So certainly, look at 1913 on. The entitlement system developed, the warmongering developed. Quickly after the Federal Reserve came into effect, they financed World War I. We had a depression in 1921. That depression lasted only 1 year because they weren't compelled by Keynesian economic theory to prolong the agony by propping up all the bad debt. There were no bailouts. So that depression ended a year. But by 1930, when the next depression came, Keynesian economics took over and said, they're too big to fail. We can't let them fail. We have to. We're good managers of the economy. Economic planning works, and we can get out of it. What did they do? They gave us a depression that lasted 17 years. And you'd think that would wake the people up, but it hasn't. They argued the case back then that the reason that we had a depression was because of the gold standard and also because of free markets. Well, that was absolutely wrong, but it was taught in our schools for decades and decades. But right now, the proof is out on the table that their policies have failed. The welfare state, the entitlement system, the inflation system, and the constant wars is a failed system. It's ruining our country. We have to reverse that direction. Thing that could have been done if we had only been able to send men and women to Washington that understood the Constitution and promised and lived up to their promise and obeyed the Constitution, we would not have the problems that we have today. Now, if that was the cause of our problem, Why wouldn't the solution be make sure we send nobody to Washington, House, Senate, or the presidency that doesn't understand the Constitution, and you believe them when they make a promise that they will obey the Constitution?